Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I want you to imagine for a second someone walking up to you right now.
Okay.
And telling you that the absolute worst day of your life, like the day your career fell apart or you lost everything keeping you secure,
Right.
that this day is actually the most valuable thing that will ever happen to you.
You'd probably want to punch them.
Exactly. I mean, it sounds totally absurd. It sounds like the absolute worst kind of toxic positivity.
Yeah, it really does.
But what if there's an ancient framework that actually makes that true?
Yeah.
Not by, pretending the pain isn't real.
Right, because that never works.
No, it doesn't. But by fundamentally changing what that pain produces.
And that's exactly what we're looking at today.
Yeah. Welcome to a very special deep dive. Today, we are focusing exclusively on one of the most intensely practical, just hard-hitting texts from the ancient world, which is the biblical book of James.
It is so practical. It's almost aggressive in how practical it is.
It really is. So think of us as your guides today. If you are a curious learner, looking for moral clarity, or you're just trying to figure out how to apply ancient wisdom to the absolute chaos of modern life.
Which, let's be honest, is all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Then you are in the exact right place. We aren't just going to list what this text says. We're going to explore the mechanics of why it works and, how you can actually use it.
And to really grasp how to use it, we have to start with the man who wrote it.
The context, right?
Yes, context isn't just trivia. It's the lens through which the entire message focuses. The letter opens with a very simple introduction. It just says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Which seems pretty standard, right?
It seems standard until you look at what is entirely missing from that introduction.
Oh, because of who he actually was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Historically, this specific James is widely understood to be the brother of Jesus.
Wow. Okay, so that's a massive credential.
It's the ultimate trump card. He was a prominent leader in the early church in Jerusalem. If anyone had the authority to pull rank, it was him.
In today's world, that's exactly what would happen.
Oh, for sure.
You'd have the verified check mark, right? A bio that says, brother of the founder.
I'm the founder of the universe.
Yeah, and you'd leverage that for every single ounce of cultural capital you could get. It's just human nature.
It is. But instead of coasting on nepotism, he identifies himself merely as a servant.
Just a servant.
Yeah. He considers it a higher honor to serve in the trenches than to, boast about a biological connection.
That really sets a specific tone right from the jump.
It really does. He isn't demanding authority from a throne. He's writing as a minister who is deeply, almost painfully concerned for his people.
And he's writing to a very specific group of people, right? The 12 tribes.
Right. He addresses it to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad.
Okay, so that word scattered, it carries so much weight.
It really does. It refers to the diaspora, the dispersion.
So this isn't just like a demographic note.
No, not at all. We have to understand the mechanics of this scattering.
Right.
These people didn't just decide to, move to the suburbs for a better commute.
Right.
They were driven out by intense persecution, deep factionalism, and extreme socioeconomic pressure.
So they were essentially refugees.
Exactly. Living as marginalized outsiders in foreign cultures where they had no power, no influence, and totally zero security.
That's terrifying.
But there is a brilliant piece of historical insight here. While they were scattered by the wrath of their circumstances.
Driven out by all these crumbling factions.
Right. There was a deeper providence at work. The ancient perspective here is that God uses this exact displacement to diffuse the light of their faith across different countries.
Oh, wow. So they feel like they're just collateral damage in this chaotic world.
Yeah, but the text is arguing they're actually seeds being planted.
That's a beautiful way to look at it.
They might feel completely forgotten, but their scattering is the exact mechanism being used to spread their influence.
Well, let's figure out what's underneath this for you, the listener, because you might feel scattered in your own life right now.
I think most people do, honestly.
Totally. You might be listening to this on a commute, feeling entirely fragmented by the insane pressures of your career.
Or alienated from your community.
Yeah, or just totally overwhelmed by an information ecosystem that literally feels like it's designed to make you anxious.
It is designed for that. Yeah.
Right. You feel like you've lost your center of gravity. And James is writing directly into that exact feeling of displacement.
He is. And his very first piece of advice to people who have lost everything is, honestly, it's shocking.
Yeah, what does he say?
He says, "Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations," which translates to various trials or hardships.
Okay, I really have to push back here.
I figured you would.
I mean, what does this actually mean in practice? Because if my life is falling apart, if I just lost my job or I'm dealing with a chronic illness,
Right.
am I supposed to just slap a smile on my face and pretend I'm thrilled?
No, not at all.
Because that feels delusional.
It totally feels delusional if we misunderstand the definition of joy he's using.
Okay, so what is the distinction?
Well, James does not say the pain itself is joyful. He isn't advocating for masochism. And he certainly isn't pushing modern toxic positivity.
Where you just ignore the negative vibes.
Right. Ignore the bad, only good vibes. That's not this. He says to count it joy because of what the trial produces.
Okay, the product of the pain.
Yes. The mechanism is right there in the text. The testing of your faith works patience.
Works patience.
And if patience is allowed to have its perfect work, you become entire, wanting nothing.
So he is telling us that trials are not random, chaotic punishments.
Exactly. They are active, precise tools in a forge.
So the joy is not in the fire itself. The joy is in the knowledge that the fire is burning away the impurities in the metal.
That is the exact mechanism.
Yeah.
And we really need to distinguish this from another philosophy that was incredibly popular in the ancient world.
Stoicism, right?
Yes. And honestly, is having a massive resurgence today.
Oh, absolutely. The internet is completely flooded with modern Stoic philosophy right now.
Right. The podcast bros love Stoicism. And Stoicism taught a kind of emotional apathy.
Like becoming a robot.
Basically, the ultimate goal was to become completely insensible to affliction. You grit your teeth, you detach your emotions.
You build a fortress around your mind.
Yeah, and you refuse to let the pain affect you. But the Christian patience James is describing operates on a completely different psychological paradigm.
How so?
It is not about becoming numb. It is about a triumphant, active joy.
Because you recognize the trial is actively constructing something.
Exactly. Something in you that could not be built any other way. It is carving out the internal capacity for what he later calls the crown of life.
Oh, wow. So you don't detach from the trial?
No, you lean into it, knowing it's a tool.
I see the difference. Like, Stoicism is about building a shield so the world can't hurt you.
Right.
And James is saying the world is going to hurt you. But you can use that exact hurt as the raw material to build your own character.
That is profound, yes.
But there's a really important pivot he makes right after this. Because the word trial and the word temptation get very muddy.
Extremely muddy.
There's a huge psychological difference between an external hardship hitting you and an internal allure drawing you toward doing something destructive.
This raises a critical question, and it's one of the most common human defense mechanisms.
Blaming others.
Blaming circumstances or even blaming God.
Right.
When we mess up, we want to say, well, I was just put in a bad situation.
Right.
James anticipates this explicitly. He warns his readers never to say, I am tempted of God, when they are drawn toward evil.
So he's clarifying the diagnostic landscape of our struggles.
Exactly. An external affliction, like poverty, sickness, losing a job, that is a trial.
That's the forge.
Yes, that is the forge. But a temptation to commit sin, that internal magnetic pull toward moral compromise, that never comes from God.
The text is pretty absolute on this, isn't it?
It is absolute. God cannot be tempted with evil, and he tempts no one.
This is where it gets really fascinating, because James then gives us an autopsy of how self-destruction actually works.
He breaks it down like a biological process.
Right. He says, every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed.
So it doesn't start with some external boogeyman forcing your hand.
It starts quietly, inside your own head.
And the psychology embedded in the original language here is just brilliant.
What's the language?
The words used for drawn away and enticed, they carry the very specific connotations of hunting and fishing.
Like bait on a hook.
Exactly like that. When you go fishing, you don't throw a bare hook into the water and expect the fish to bite.
No, obviously not. You need a worm or a shiny lure.
Right. You hide the hook inside something the fish naturally desires. The text is revealing the cunning, flattering nature of temptation.
Wow.
Sin doesn't usually overpower us by sheer force. It doesn't scream at us.
It flatters us.
It flatters us. It begs us. It beguiles us to our own destruction by using our own specific, tailored desires as the bait.
That is such a chilling reality check.
It really is.
Think about how that plays out today. Let's say someone destroys their career through embezzlement.
Right. A classic white-collar crime.
Yeah. They didn't just wake up one morning and decide to ruin their life. It started with a tiny, flattering thought.
Like what?
Like, I work harder than everyone else. I deserve a little extra. No one will notice. It's just a temporary loan to myself.
Yes. The bait perfectly matches their internal desire for validation and security.
And James continues that exact biological metaphor. He says that once that desire conceives, it brings forth sin.
And sin, when it is fully matured, brings forth death.
It's a tragic life cycle. It starts as a fleeting thought, a tiny little bait you swallow.
Then it matures into an action.
The action becomes a habit.
And the habit ultimately kills your career, your marriage, or your soul.
It is a stark, unrelenting warning.
Very stark. But the genius of James is that he never leaves you with just the diagnosis.
He provides a prescription.
Always. If you are in the middle of these intense external trials, and you are simultaneously fighting off these internal flattering baits.
You feel completely lost.
Right. What do? He says you ask for wisdom, and you ask God, whom James beautifully describes as the Father of lights, with whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning.
I want to pause on that phrase, Father of lights.
It's a great phrase.
Why use that specific astronomical language?
Because it contrasts perfectly with our human experience.
Okay, how so?
Think about the physical sun in the sky. It casts shifting shadows depending on the time of day.
Right.
It sets every single night, plunging us into darkness. It changes with the seasons, but God's nature, James is arguing, is entirely constant.
So there is no shifting shadow.
There is no eclipse. He is the ultimate, unwavering source of every good and perfect gift.
So when you are totally disoriented by the chaos of a trial, you need an anchor point that does not move.
Exactly. And James says God gives this wisdom liberally without upbraiding.
Which means?
Meaning, he won't mock you or criticize you for needing help.
But there is a catch, right?
There's always a catch.
The mechanism of asking requires a specific mindset. James says you have to ask in faith without wavering.
Yes, because the person who doubts, the double-minded man, is unstable in all his ways.
And then he uses an analogy that I think every single person living in the modern digital age can relate to.
A wave.
The wave. He compares this double-minded person to a wave of the sea, driven by the wind and tossed.
It's such a visceral image.
Let's really look at a wave. It surges upward, right? It reaches toward the sky in this massive swell of faith and confidence.
But it has no foundation.
Exactly. So a second later, it crashes down into a deep trough of distrust, anxiety, and despair.
It is entirely at the mercy of whatever wind is blowing that day.
That is the perfect visualization of a mind vibrating back and forth.
It really is. One moment, you are trusting the process, trusting God, operating on high moral principles.
And the next moment,
you check your bank account, or you read a terrifying news headline, and you instantly crash into panic.
you start obsessing over worldly security and survival tactics.
We see this constantly today.
Constantly. People's entire emotional state is dictated by the algorithm.
Oh, entirely.
A good email comes in, they're on top of the world. A bad text comes in, their life is literally over.
They are a wave.
And James is saying, if you want to survive the actual heavy trials of life, you cannot be a wave. You cannot operate on that kind of emotional volatility.
You have to drop an anchor into something deeper.
Which serves as the perfect conceptual bridge into the second major theme of this first chapter.
Because dropping that anchor, gaining that stabilizing wisdom, it isn't just a matter of downloading intellectual information.
It requires a shift.
A radical shift in your daily posture. James lays out the blueprint. He says, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath.
For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God.
Precisely.
Okay, swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath.
Yeah.
I feel like if you logged onto any social media platform today and did the exact opposite of that, you'd go viral.
You'd be a millionaire. Our entire modern culture is engineered to reward being slow to hear, incredibly swift to speak, and permanently entrenched in wrath.
The monetization of outrage.
Exactly. It's a modern business model. But the psychological trap is ancient.
How ancient?
Well, there's a fascinating historical anecdote from the early church commentaries regarding a massive theological debate.
Who was the debate between?
Between St. Augustine and a Manichae opponent.
Oh, wow. Okay, so heavy hitters.
Heavy hitters. And as you can imagine, these debates were intense. Voices were raised. Tempers flared.
Just a shouting match.
Yeah, it was turning into a shouting match where neither side was actually listening to the other.
Classic debate.
Right. But finally, Augustine stopped the argument and said something brilliant. He said, neither let me hear thee, nor do thou hear me, But let us both hear the apostle.
Wow. Like, let's take our egos out of this entirely and submit to a higher truth.
Exactly. It's the perfect application of James's principle.
Because when we let passion and ego and wrath take over, we create a lot of heat, but we generate absolutely no light.
None. The wrath of man never produces the righteousness or the justice that God desires.
To actually gain wisdom, we have to quiet our own internal noise.
We must receive with meekness what James calls the engrafted word.
The truth that is planted deep inside us.
Right.
But listening, as hard as that is only step one.
Yes.
And this is where James gets incredibly uncomfortable for people who love to consume information.
He really goes after them.
He gives a massive warning. He says, "Be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves."
Deceiving yourselves.
Let's translate this to today. Is this essentially describing the person who reads 100 self-help books a year?
Yes. Or listens to endless deep dive analysis like this very one.
Right. They highlight quotes, they nod along, they feel really enlightened.
But they never actually change a single habit in their daily life.
That is the exact modern equivalent. It is the illusion of progress.
We confuse the dopamine hit of learning something new with the actual friction of doing it.
And James illustrates this with one of the most famous, just piercing metaphors in the entire text.
The mirror.
Yes, the mirror. He compares the word of truth to a mirror. He says that if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a glass.
Let's expand on this mirror analogy because it's so rich. What does a mirror actually do?
It reflects reality.
Unfiltered reality. It doesn't flatter you. When you look in the mirror in the morning, it shows you the spots, the blemishes,
Messed up hair.
the dirt on your face.
Yeah.
It diagnoses your true condition.
Now, the normal human response to seeing dirt on your face is to go to the sink and wash it off.
Obviously. But James says this self-deceiving person looks in the mirror, clearly sees all the flaws that need fixing.
And then just walks away.
And immediately they forget what they look like. They take absolutely no action.
It's like staring at your bank statement, seeing that you are bleeding money on subscriptions you don't even use.
Acknowledging it's a huge problem.
Yeah, and then closing the app and going shopping anyway.
That is the perfect modern parallel. You saw the reality, but you refused the remedy.
The purpose of the mirror isn't just to supply you with data about your face.
No, it's a prompt transformation.
If you just consume the data, like if you just read the philosophy or agree with the theology, but you never let it alter your behavior, you are living in a state of deep self-deception.
Which brings up the obvious question, what does doing actually look like?
Right. If we aren't supposed to just sit around and debate theology, what is the action plan?
James gives us a remarkably concise working definition of what he calls pure and undefiled religion.
And spoiler alert, his definition has absolutely nothing to do with what kind of building you sit in on the weekend.
Or what songs you sing. Not at all.
He says pure religion before God is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world.
If we pull back and look at the underlying mechanism here, James is taking a machete to all the performative, ceremonial layers of religion that people love to hide behind.
He just cuts right through it.
He reduces genuine faith to two core operational metrics, charity and purity.
Let's talk about that charity piece first. In this context, it's not just writing a check, is it?
No, the word visit implies active, proximate compassion, getting close to the pain.
And he specifically names orphans and widows.
Because in the ancient socioeconomic structure, they were the absolute most vulnerable.
They had zero safety net.
Zero. They couldn't pay you back. They couldn't offer you networking opportunities or status. Caring for them was an act of pure, unreciprocated love.
And the second metric is purity, keeping yourself unspotted from the world.
Which doesn't mean moving to a cabin in the woods and isolating yourself from society.
Right. It means maintaining your moral integrity while you're in the world.
It means engaging with society without absorbing its corrupt, exploitative value systems. It is outward compassion fused with inward character.
Outward compassion, inward character. I love that. And that concept of avoiding the world's corrupt value systems flows perfectly into chapter 2.
It does, where James decides to tackle one of those corrupt systems head on.
The trap of partiality.
Yes. He sets up a hypothetical scenario, but it's clearly something that was actually happening in their communities.
What's the scenario?
He says, imagine your assembly. The Greek word used here is synagogue.
Which means?
In this context, it could mean a church gathering or even a local court of justice.
Yeah.
2 men walk into this assembly.
Okay.
One is wearing a gold ring and fine, expensive clothing. He practically radiates wealth and status. The other man walks in wearing vile, filthy raiment.
He's clearly destitute.
Right.
We can all visualize this. It's the ancient equivalent of a guy stepping out of a luxury sports car in a tailored suit.
Followed by a guy pushing his belongings in a shopping cart.
Exactly. And James describes the reaction of the assembly.
They look at the rich guy, they fawn over him, and they say, please, sit right here in this place of honor.
And the poor guy.
They look at the poor guy and say, you can stand over there in the corner, or if you want to sit on the floor down by my footstool.
Ouch. And James does not hold back his critique here.
He says, are you not then partial in yourselves and are become judges of evil thoughts?
Now let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Please do.
Because this is where the friction of the text really hits modern life. Isn't this just how the world works?
What do you mean?
I mean, isn't giving VIP treatment to big donors or networking with successful people or honoring executives, isn't that just a basic functional reality of society? Why is James calling this an evil thought?
It's a vital pushback, and we have to be very precise here. James is not condemning basic civil respect. And he isn't saying you can't acknowledge different roles in a corporate structure.
So what is the sin?
The mechanism of the sin here is spiritual and moral partiality. It is when you judge a human being's intrinsic worth or their value to the community based entirely on their financial portfolio.
To really grasp the severity of this, we have to look at the historical legal context, right?
Yes. Ancient Jewish scholars, like Maimonides, noted that their legal codes explicitly required absolute visual equality in a court of justice.
Visual equality, what does that mean?
If a rich man and a poor man came before a judge, they had to be treated identically.
Period.
Either both were given a seat or both were required to stand.
Yeah.
There could be absolutely no visual disparity because justice must be entirely blind to wealth.
Wow. So by elevating the rich man and degrading the poor man in this assembly.
They aren't just being impolite. They are fundamentally corrupting the concept of justice.
And even worse, they are adopting a value system that is diametrically opposed to the nature of God.
Exactly. James reminds them of a spiritual reality. Hath not God chosen the poor of this world rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom?
So when you honor wealth over grace, when you fawn over a gold ring while ignoring the character of the person wearing it,
you are actively insulting God's value system. You are violating what James calls the royal law.
Which is?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Now, as we dive deeper into this section, it is very important to pause and lay down a strict ground rule for our deep dive today.
Good call.
James goes on to severely critique how the wealthy in his day were oppressing the poor, like dragging them into courts, leveraging legal power against them.
Right.
We must explicitly state to you, the listener, that we are impartially reporting the biblical text's ancient socioeconomic critique. We are not taking modern political sides.
We are not endorsing any modern left-wing or right-wing political manifestos regarding class dynamics or wealth redistribution.
Exactly. We are strictly conveying James's ancient moral warnings against greed, exploitation, and spiritual partiality, exactly as the source material presents it.
That is a crucial boundary because James is addressing the spiritual disease of the human heart, not outlining a fiscal policy for a nation state.
Right, and his practical solution to this disease of partiality is what he calls the law of liberty.
He tells his readers to speak and act as people who know they're going to be judged by this law of freedom.
And he attaches a terrifying caveat.
He does. For he shall have judgment without mercy that hath showed no mercy.
That is a heavy psychological reality.
It is.
The standard of mercy you apply to the guy in the filthy clothing is the exact standard of mercy the ultimate judge is going to apply to you.
If you show zero mercy, you get zero mercy.
But this entire discussion of judgment, mercy, and, how our actions matter leads us right into the most famous, most complex, and arguably the most debated section of this entire book.
Chapter 2, verse 14.
Yes. This is the great paradox of faith versus works.
Oh boy, here we go.
James writes, "What doth it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him?"
And he concludes with the mic drop line. Faith without works is dead.
I have to admit, as someone who reads a lot of history and theology, this sounds like a massive, unsolvable contradiction.
You are not alone in thinking that. This passage has caused centuries of intense theological debate.
And the reason for the friction is the Apostle Paul. Right?
Exactly, the Apostle Paul. In the book of Romans, chapter 3, Paul explicitly states that justification being made right with God is by faith alone, entirely apart from the deeds of the law.
He hammers this point home relentlessly.
Relentlessly. Yet here is James, mere pages away in the same Bible, saying verbatim, "By works a man is justified, and not by faith only."
Okay, so we have two foundational ancient writers seemingly saying the exact opposite thing.
Right.
Is one of them wrong? Are they fighting with each other? How do we possibly reconcile this?
The key to untangling this knot lies entirely in understanding their respective contexts.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Our source material provides a masterful synthesis of this problem. It explains that the apparent contradiction vanishes when you realize they are speaking from a different standpoint.
Different standpoint.
Yes, they are looking at the exact same timeline of a person's spiritual life, but they are answering two completely different questions.
Walk me through that timeline. What is Paul's standpoint versus James's standpoint?
Let's look at Paul first. Paul is looking at a person before conversion. He's addressing the internal root.
The root of the issue.
Right. He is answering the question, how can a guilty, broken sinner ever be justified or made right before a perfectly holy God?
And Paul's answer is absolute. You cannot earn it.
You cannot balance the cosmic scales by doing enough good deeds. You are justified solely by faith. That is the root.
But James,
on the other hand, is looking at a person after conversion. He's dealing with a totally different problem.
What's the problem James is facing?
He is writing to people who are actively claiming, hey, I have faith. I believe the right theology. But they are living terrible, exploitative, selfish lives.
So James is answering a different question.
He's answering, how does a person prove to the watching world that their invisible internal faith is actually genuine?
And James's answer is, you prove it by your works, your actions.
Exactly. Paul is talking about the root of salvation. James is talking about the fruit that proves the root is alive.
That distinction changes everything.
It really does. Paul is fighting legalism, the idea that you can earn God's love.
And James is fighting antinomianism.
Yes, the idea that because you have God's love, how you live doesn't matter at all.
And what's brilliant is that both of these authors use the exact same historical figure to prove their point.
Abraham.
Right. But they point to two entirely different moments in Abraham's life.
It's a masterful piece of biblical deduction when you lay them side by side.
So what does Paul point to?
Paul points to Genesis chapter 15. This is early in Abraham's journey. God makes him a massive promise, and the text simply says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness.
Boom! He was justified by his internal faith at the moment he believed. Paul's point is made.
Exactly. But James bypasses Genesis 15 entirely and points to an event that happened 20 years later in Genesis 22.
The terrifying moment when Abraham is asked to offer his son Isaac on the altar?
Yes, James points to that agonizing action and says, this act completed or perfected his faith.
So the action on the mountain didn't save Abraham. He was already justified 20 years prior.
Right. But the action on the mountain proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the faith he claimed in Genesis 15 was real, operative, and totally transformative.
The action is the evidence.
Yes.
And just to drive the point home, James uses a second example that is the total opposite of the esteemed patriarch Abraham. He uses Rahab. Rahab was a woman with a notorious past living in Jericho.
But she proved her faith wasn't just a quiet intellectual agreement with Israel's God.
She proved it by making an active, incredibly dangerous, life-on-the-line decision to hide the Israelite messengers.
Because James is deeply concerned with this modern idea that faith is just intellectual assent.
Right, just agreeing with facts.
And he drops an absolute bombshell to shatter that idea. He says, you believe there is one God. Good for you. You have the right theology.
Boy, guess what?
Even the demons believe that, and they shudder.
We really need to sit with the psychological horror of that insight.
It's terrifying.
Think about what James is saying. The demons possess perfect theology. They don't have a crisis of belief.
No, they know exactly who God is. They know his power, and they believe in his existence with absolute certainty. They have 100% intellectual faith.
But that intellectual faith doesn't save them. It only produces terror.
They shudder. Why? Because their belief is entirely disconnected from loving obedience or transformative action.
James is warning us that a faith that is merely a cold, abstract opinion in your head,
a faith that doesn't move your hands or change your habits,
it is functionally no better than the faith of demons.
That is just a brutal reality check for anyone who thinks checking a religious box on a census form means anything.
Yeah, totally. And he closes this entire argument with a stark, biological analogy.
The body without the spirit.
Oh, right. He says, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also.
Just visualize that. A body without a spirit, without breath, is a corpse.
You can dress it up in an expensive suit. You can prop it up in a chair.
You can put makeup on it,
Yeah.
but it has no life. It can't do anything. And frankly, after a while, it becomes offensive.
James is saying that a loud profession of faith without the actual breath of compassionate action is just a spiritual corpse.
You can't just talk the talk.
And speaking of talking, James uses that exact pivot to move into chapter 3, where he focuses with laser intensity on the very instrument we use to talk the talk.
The tongue.
The tongue. And he starts this section with a very specific warning to a specific group of people.
He says, "My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation."
I always found that opening strange. In older translations it says masters, but modern translations usually say teachers.
Right, teachers.
Why does he start a chapter about the tongue by telling people not to become teachers? Were people just lining up to give TED Talks in the early church?
In a way, yes. We have to understand the cultural dynamics of the early church assemblies.
What were they like?
There was a strong, often ego-driven desire among many people to be the public teachers, the didaskaloi.
They wanted the prestige.
They wanted the prestige. They wanted the platform. They loved the authority of standing up and dictating theology to others.
But they lacked the qualifications.
Exactly. They lacked the spiritual maturity, the lived experience, and the character qualifications required for the job.
So James is throwing cold water on their ambition.
He is warning them that with a public platform comes a much, much stricter standard of judgment.
When you presume to speak for God, or when you take on the role of shaping other people's minds, your words carry immense weight.
And you will be held strictly accountable for the damage those words do.
Let's translate that to today.
Oh, it translates perfectly.
We live in the era of the influencer, the podcaster, the thought leader. Everyone wants a microphone.
Everyone wants a platform to broadcast their opinions to thousands of people.
James is saying, be careful what you wish for. That microphone is a massive liability.
And to explain why it's a liability, he launches into this incredible discourse on the disproportionate power of human speech.
He uses 3 vivid analogies, right?
Yes, to explain how something so small can control so much. First, he talks about the bit in a horse's mouth.
You have this massive, muscular, powerful animal, but you put a tiny piece of metal in its mouth, and a rider can turn its entire body.
Second, he looks at ships. Huge vessels carrying tons of cargo driven by fierce, violent winds.
Yet they are steered through storms by a tiny little rudder entirely at the whim of the pilot.
And third, he talks about fire, a microscopic spark that can set an entire massive forest ablaze.
These analogies perfectly illustrate the core mechanic of the tongue. Size does not equal influence.
Exactly. The tongue is one of the smallest organs in the human body, but it boasts great things.
It dictates the direction of your life, just like the rudder dictates the ship.
But James doesn't just marvel at its power. He quickly pivots to its terrifying potential for destruction.
He describes the tongue as a world of iniquity.
He says it defiles the whole body, and it sets on fire the entire course of nature.
And then he traces the source of that destructive fire. He says it is set on fire by hell itself, using the Greek word Gehenna.
That is incredibly intense language.
It is, but it feels completely accurate when you look at modern cancel culture, or how a single malicious rumor can literally destroy a person's life, their marriage, their business overnight.
It is a spark that burns down a forest.
But then James says something that honestly feels incredibly defeating. He looks at human history and says, humanity has tamed every kind of beast, bird, reptile, and sea creature.
We put killer whales in glass tanks. We put lions in cages.
But, he says, no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison.
So, I have to ask the obvious question.
Right.
If no man can tame it, why are we even trying? Are we just biologically doomed to be toxic? Is there any hope for us?
It's a crucial question, and this is where we have to read the text with theological discernment rather than just fatalism.
When James says no man can tame the tongue, he is speaking of human power operating in isolation.
By our own sheer willpower.
Right. By sheer willpower, by reading communication hacks, or by taking anger management classes, we cannot permanently eradicate the malice, the gossip, and the venom from our speech.
The infection goes too deep.
So it's not a hardware problem with the tongue, it's a software problem with the heart.
Exactly. And James highlights the absolute absurdity of our current broken state.
He points out that we use the exact same mouth to sing praises to God our Father, and then an hour later, we use that same mouth to curse and destroy human beings who are made in the very image of God.
He uses a brilliant natural analogy to show how unnatural this is. He asks, does a spring of water yield both sweet fresh water and bitter salt water from the same opening?
Does a fig tree bear olives? Does a grapevine bear figs?
The answer is obvious, no. Nature produces what it is.
Meaning, if your heart is actually a fresh spring, it shouldn't be pouring out toxic sludge in the comments section of a YouTube video.
It shouldn't be snapping viciously at your spouse when they ask a simple question.
If toxic water is coming out, it proves that the source, the underground aquifer of your heart, is contaminated.
Which means the only way to tame the tongue is to get a new heart.
It requires divine grace, not just better manners.
And that realization brings us perfectly into the next major section in chapters 3 and 4, where James explores the root cause of this contaminated water.
He traces the toxic words back to the toxic operating system that produces them.
He contrasts two completely different kinds of wisdom that govern human behavior: earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom.
Let's break those down, because this is the diagnostic key for almost every conflict we experience. What are the defining characteristics of earthly wisdom?
James describes earthly wisdom with 3 devastating adjectives. It is earthly, sensual, and devilish or demonic.
At its core, earthly wisdom is driven by bitter jealousy and selfish ambition.
It is a scarcity mindset.
It views life as a zero-sum game, where the only way for you to win is for someone else to lose.
It justifies stepping on others, manipulating the truth, and harboring resentment, all in the name of getting ahead or protecting what's yours.
And James points out that the result of this wisdom is always mathematically the same: confusion and every evil work.
You can see that operating in toxic corporate environments, right? Where everyone is operating on earthly wisdom, backstabbing each other for a promotion.
The result isn't a successful company. The result is absolute confusion and misery.
So what is the alternative? What does heavenly wisdom look like?
James gives heavenly wisdom a beautifully detailed profile. He says it is first pure, that it is peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated.
I want to focus on that phrase, easy to be entreated.
The original Greek word there is eupetis. It means being persuadable, reasonable, and willing to listen.
A person operating on heavenly wisdom doesn't stubbornly dig their heels in and refuse to admit they are wrong just to protect their ego.
Furthermore, he says it is full of mercy and good fruits, and it is without partiality.
The Greek word adikritos.
Right, meaning it doesn't judge people based on surface-level distinctions or tribal politics. And finally, it is without hypocrisy.
That is just a stunning contrast. Earthly wisdom is rigid, defensive, and ruthless. Heavenly wisdom is pure, reasonable, and merciful.
And if we translate this diagnosis to modern realities, we suddenly have the explanation for every argument, every divorce, every factional church split, and every war we see today.
In chapter 4, James asks this point-blank question to his readers. Where do wars and fightings among you come from?
He doesn't blame the economy. He doesn't blame the political climate.
He points right back to the mirror. He says, do they not come from your lusts that war in your members?
You want something. You can't have it. So you kill and covet.
You fight and wage war. And even when you do pray and ask God for things, you ask with the wrong motives, just so you can consume it upon your own lusts.
We are literally creating our own chaos because we're running on earthly software.
That is exactly the point. The internal conflict, the warring desires inside of us, inevitably spills out and creates the external conflict.
So James, being the intensely practical guy that he is, provides the exact sequence for rebooting the system.
He gives a rapid-fire list of commands.
He says, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you.
Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded.
And then he says something that strikes the modern ear as quite stark. Be afflicted, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to heaviness.
Yeah, I have to admit, that sounds like a massive buzzkill.
It does.
Turn your laughter to mourning. Is James just fundamentally opposed to people having a good time?
It does sound harsh to a culture addicted to entertainment. But as the commentaries point out, this is not a blanket ban on joy.
It is a targeted prescription for spiritual gravity.
Right. James is addressing people who are living in a state of active spiritual rebellion.
Their selfish ambitions are destroying their communities, they are exploiting the poor, they are verbally assassinating each other.
And yet they are laughing it off.
Yeah.
They are living in superficial, flippant mirth.
James is saying, wake up. This is not the time for a comedy show. When your life is causing damage, it's time to get serious.
It's time to actually mourn your compromises, to grieve over the pain you've caused, and to genuinely humble yourself in the sight of the Lord.
Because only when you hit that rock bottom of humility can God actually lift you up.
That makes perfect sense. It's the difference between ignoring a gaping wound because you're distracted by a movie versus enduring the pain of letting a doctor stitch it up so you can actually heal.
And a huge part of that humility, of realizing we aren't the center of the universe, involves how we look at the future.
Which brings us to one of my favorite, most piercing parts of this entire letter.
James decides to tackle the sheer arrogance of human planning.
He sets up the scenario. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make a profit.
When I read that, I instantly see us staring at our 5-year plans.
Oh, yeah.
I see us color-coding our calendar apps, projecting our stock portfolios, mapping out our career trajectories, acting like we are the absolute sovereign lords of time.
It is the ultimate illusion of control. We build these intricate spreadsheets of our lives, assuming we hold the pen that writes tomorrow.
And James just pops the balloon.
He reminds them of the stark, terrifying reality of human biology. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away.
We are a vapor. We are the fog on your windshield that burns off as soon as the sun comes up.
It is a profound humbling. To make rigid, arrogant plans without acknowledging our extreme fragility is, according to James, boasting in our own arrogance. And all such boasting is evil.
The core wisdom here isn't that planning is bad. It's that planning without humility is bad.
James says we ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that.
I know a lot of older generations used to write DV at the bottom of their letters, Deo volente, God willing.
The Greek concept is syntheo, with the leave of God.
But this can't just be a religious catchphrase we tack onto the end of an email to sound spiritual.
No, it has to be a foundational worldview. It is the deep psychological recognition that every single breath I take today is a gift, and every plan I make for tomorrow is subject to a higher sovereign timeline.
Which honestly requires a massive amount of trust, especially when that sovereign timeline includes suffering.
Which brings us to the final chapter of the book, chapter 5.
James shifts his focus from the arrogance of the future to the injustices of the present.
He turns his attention back to the wealthy. But this time, he is not reasoning with them. He is delivering a searing prophetic warning to the hoarders of wealth.
And the imagery he uses is apocalyptic. He tells the rich oppressors to weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon them.
He says their hoarded riches are corrupted and their expensive garments are moth-eaten.
He paints this incredibly vivid, visceral picture. He says, your gold and silver are corroded. They are rusted.
And that very rust will stand as a witness against you in the final judgment, and it will eat your flesh like fire.
And he outlines exactly why this judgment is falling. It isn't just because they have money, it's because of how they got it and what they did with it.
He says the cries of the reapers, the laborers who harvested their fields, whose wages were fraudulently kept back, those cries have bypassed the corrupt earthly courts and reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts.
Now again, keeping our rule of impartiality for this deep dive, we must emphasize that James is not outlining a political policy for minimum wage or state redistribution.
He is declaring absolute divine justice. He is saying that God hears the cries of the oppressed, and the ultimate cosmic judge is paying close attention to systemic greed.
That is precisely the theological point. The judge is watching.
And because the ultimate judge is watching, James turns away from the oppressors and speaks directly to the oppressed believers.
He gives them their marching orders for how to survive this injustice, and his command is one word: patience.
He says, "Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Establish your hearts."
Let's explore the mechanism of this patience, because waiting while you are suffering is agonizing. How do you do it?
James gives them 3 powerful mental models to anchor their patience.
First, he points to the farmer.
A farmer does the hard work of planting the seed, but then he has to wait for the early and late rain. He can't yell at the dirt to make the crops grow faster.
He can't manipulate the clouds.
He has to trust the seasons and wait for the harvest.
Second, he points to the prophets.
These were men who spoke in the name of the Lord and faced immense affliction and persecution, yet they endured.
They are the historical proof that speaking the truth often brings suffering, but it is a noble suffering.
And the third example is the ultimate case study in suffering, Job.
Everyone knows about the patience of Job. This is a man who lost his wealth, his health, and his children in one day.
But James says, "You have heard of the patience of Job, and you have seen the end of the Lord," meaning you saw how God resolved the story.
You saw that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy.
The message is, the story isn't over yet. Don't give up in the middle of the trial.
And just as importantly, James adds a crucial warning about how we treat each other while we are waiting in the middle of the trial.
He says, "Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door."
This is such a brilliant psychological insight. When we are under intense external pressure, when the economy is terrible, when we are facing persecution, when we're just stressed out, what is our natural instinct?
It isn't usually to attack the giant system oppressing us.
Our instinct is to turn and lash out at the people closest to us. We groan, we grudge, we bicker with our spouses, our coworkers, our fellow believers.
James says, "Do not do it. Hold the line. The judge is standing right at the door. Don't let the external pressure cause you to cannibalize your own community."
And as part of maintaining that community integrity under pressure, he adds a very specific warning that requires some discernment to understand properly.
He says, "But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea and your nay, nay, lest ye fall into condemnation."
We need to clarify this. Is he just telling people not to drop F-bombs when they hit their thumb with a hammer?
No, he's dealing with something much deeper regarding integrity. As the historical commentaries clarify, he is warning against customary, needless, profane swearing in everyday conversation.
In that culture, people would constantly invoke an oath by heaven or by the temple or by the earth just to back up a basic statement.
It was a way of saying, "I swear to God, I'm telling the truth this time."
James is saying that your personal character should be so solid, so known for truth-telling, that your simple yes means yes, and your simple no means no.
You shouldn't need to call down lightning from heaven to convince your neighbors you aren't lying. A community built on heavenly wisdom is a community built on absolute, unadorned truth.
That is a phenomenal practical benchmark for integrity. If you have to constantly swear you are telling the truth, it probably means your baseline is deception.
And as he brings this incredible letter to a close, James shifts his focus entirely to the healing power of that community.
He gives a beautiful, practical rhythm for handling the highs and lows of human life together.
He says, "Is anyone among you afflicted? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praises."
But then he addresses the heavy stuff. Is anyone sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord.
And the prayer of faith shall save the sick.
This is a profound picture of mutual care. The isolated, scattered individuals we met in Chapter 1 are now being woven together into a tight-knit safety net.
And he goes even deeper into the psychology of community healing. He writes, "Confess your faults one to another, and pray one for another that ye may be healed."
Notice the structure here. He does not say you must confess exclusively to a priest or a singular elevated leader.
He emphasizes mutual, reciprocal confession among the community of friends.
Because shame thrives in isolation. When you are hiding your failures, your addictions, or your toxic habits, they gain power over you.
But when you bring those struggles out into the light with trusted, empathetic believers, it breaks the power of the isolation. It is the beginning of actual healing.
And James promises that this kind of community prayer works. He says, "The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much."
And to prove that this isn't just theory, he brings up a historical heavyweight, Elijah.
But look at how he brings up Elijah. Elijah was one of the greatest prophets in Jewish history. He called down fire from heaven.
To the average reader, Elijah was an untouchable demigod.
But James specifically demystifies him. He says Elijah was a human being with a nature subject to like passions as we are.
He was just like us. He had fears, he got depressed, he was entirely human.
Yet he prayed earnestly that it wouldn't rain, and it stopped raining for 3.5 years. Then he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain.
The point James is driving home is that you don't need to be a flawless superhero for your prayers to matter.
Your prayers, when offered in fervent faith and alignment with God's will, carry immense world-altering power.
Which culminates in the ultimate mission of this entire community found in the very last 2 verses of the book.
James writes, "Brethren, if any of you do err from the truth, and one convert him, let him know that he which converteth this sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death and shall hide a multitude of sins."
What a way to end the letter. He doesn't end with a final threat. He ends with a rescue mission.
It is the ultimate expression of the pure religion he defined back in chapter 1.
It's not about condemning the person who wanders away. It's about going out into the dark, finding the person who is tangled up in earthly wisdom, and actively bringing them back to the truth.
It is an active, rescuing, redemptive love.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We've talked so much about action doing the word, proving your faith with works, bridling your tongue, visiting the widow, refusing to show partiality to the rich.
But maybe the most profound action James demands from us is the internal one we started with.
The decision to stop fighting against the trials in your life and to start letting them forge you.
If your life is truly just a vapor, as James says, how much of that vapor are you currently wasting by running on bitter earthly wisdom?
And how much of it could you be investing in the slow, patient, beautiful construction of heavenly wisdom?
That is the question to leave with.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.